everyone, and welcome to this second program in our three-part series of Consciousness Central 2019, coming from the Science of Consciousness conference here in this beautiful location in Interlaken in Switzerland. I'm Nick Day, and in this program we'll be talking about the placebo effect with KATHRYN Hall from Harvard Medical School. We'll find out more about the evolution of consciousness with Eva Jablonka, and with our special guest, philanthropist and scientist Manu Bhaumik, talking about his ideas about the deeper nature of things. As always, we'll drop in on the posters, so a packed program. Stay with us. And what's your name?
My name is Anahita.
Okay, and where are you from?
I am from Iran.
From Iran?
Yes.
Oh, wow, well, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, it's a very interesting time for
Yes,
Iran.
sure.
Are you living in Iran, or did you?
No, I'm coming from Dubai.
From Dubai? Wow, this is such a wonderful international event.
Yes.
And what is it about the Science of Consciousness conference brings you all the way from Dubai to Interlaken?
Sure, I'm generally interested in the science of consciousness, what makes it happen, and how is it that we are conscious. But in my own field of study, I'm interested in how our perception of us is affecting our life.
What's your name?
Sarah Turner. So this is the conference I come to when I want to hear about quantum biology. So that's mainly why I'm here. There's some fabulous talks that I've already been to, but also psychedelics. I've been to that today and that was a surprise. I wasn't going to go to it, but it was fabulous.
Do you think that the answer to the big question might somehow be in the whole field of quantum theory?
I've been doing some work on light in the brain, and the thing with light, because it's a physical process, it stands to reason there's some quantum in there. So I'm trying to get that additional bit of information that I haven't been able to get anywhere else. And I have done. Actually, I have already got some information on that. So that's really cool.
Where are you from? Did you say where you're from?
I'm from San Francisco.
What brings you all the way from the West Coast, California, to Interlaken, Switzerland?
It had been about 4 years. I was like, okay, this year I'm going to the Science of Consciousness conference. And then I couldn't make it. And then finally said, okay, 2019, I'm fucking going. And it's like, oh, it's in Sweden or Switzerland. I said, oh, I guess I'm going to Switzerland then.
Okay, are you presenting here, or are you here to soak it all up?
Not presenting, I'm just consuming.
And are you in the field yourself? Do you have like some relationship to neuroscience or something like that?
Yeah, the connection for me is photobiomodulation and light products for light therapies.
I'm studying consciousness in my hometown, Skövde, at the university there. So I thought this would be fantastic to see how much I understand. This is my first scientific conference, actually, and I love it so far.
Excellent. Oh, well, welcome. I'm very glad you're here. And you say you're studying the science of consciousness there. So what aspect of that are you studying?
Since I'm a beginner, I'm actually interested in the whole field. So I think I will use this week to more, maybe find a field that I will go deeper into.
And now we take a look at the placebo effect with KATHRYN Hall. KATHRYN is a molecular biologist. She's director of placebo genetics at Harvard Medical School. And we join the interview as I ask her about the potential for expanding the use of placebo beyond the current clinical setting. I know you're saying that placebo is also part of standard medication as well as the placebo part of it. But I'm just wondering, harnessing this amazing power of the mind to sort of become its own healing agent, can we see other treatments perhaps that if it was placebo was incorporated more and accepted and developed, is that something we could see happening, or is this more just a bit of a pipe dream?
And as I said, you know, we are already using the placebo response in many ways, whether it's, you know, a good physician knows how to, you know, like elicit a strong placebo response by being positive, by really paying attention to the patient, by, you know, building confidence in the treatment. I do think that many drugs already target the placebo response, and if you think about it, drugs that target the placebo response are more likely to do better in clinical trials if they're boosting the placebo response, because that will allow them to do better than placebo alone. And so these are ways we're already using it. Can we use it prospectively? I think that if it was to be accepted as a treatment, you could see that if a patient comes in and they're not, you know, suicidal, they're just, you know, mildly depressed, you could say, why not we try you on placebo first? The upside is there are no side effects, and the potential for them to respond is there. And you could, you know, have them use placebos for the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you know, a couple months, and see how it goes. Because we do that anyway. We try people on different medications till we find the right one for them. So that's kind of one way that we could look at it. Another way is we could, if we do identify through the placebo people that are more likely to respond, we could say, you know, like we could really kind of even boost that. Let's say, yes, this is a, you know, a pathway that might be recommended for you. And then finally, by understanding the constellation of genes and proteins that guide placebo response, we might be able to target drugs to that pathway for those people that really can kind of boost their treatment by capturing that placebo response and adding, you know, a drug with a strong mechanism of action in there. So I think there are multiple ways that we can use what we're learning now.
Are there any areas where this really doesn't work? It sort of, I mean, it just doesn't seem to be effective. I mean, I suppose, just so I'm clear in terms of this question, that when we're talking about placebo, we're talking we're bringing some element of a sort of a psychological action rather than just but purely biochemical action, so that you've got this additive idea that I believe in the pill and it works, and so ta-da, my pain is gone.
Yeah.
The sort of thing. If I didn't believe in it, would it still work? I don't know. That's, as you say, if you're given morphine without knowing it, maybe it doesn't work so well.
It doesn't work so well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're just learning kind of what the boundaries of this
Yeah.
are. There always have been placebo responders and placebo non-responders. And there are people who not only don't respond to placebo, but they do worse on placebo. So they're like having a negative response to placebo. And we have to be very careful to pay attention to that. So there are placebo responders and non-responders. And it could be that placebo responders are not always placebo responders, that, you know, you're not always going to, you know, your depression might get better, but your cardiovascular disease is not going to get better. And I do think there are conditions and diseases that are not necessarily amenable. Certainly any pathogen is not going to respond to placebo. And so I think there are, you know, clear delineations where you need a really good drug. You know, I don't think cancer, for instance, is going to respond to placebo. It's never been really rigorously tested because you don't use a placebo treatment when you're treating people with cancer. And you could argue that, you know, you could see that, you know, cancer prevention might be amenable to a placebo because you're reducing stress. And if you reduce stress, you might reduce all the kind of reactive oxygen species and all the sequelae of stress. And so you could kind of develop a concept or a pathway that it could be preventative of chronic diseases. But I think there are obviously limitations to placebos, as there are limitations to any drug.
I think there's a perception at the moment that we have rather a sick society. Somehow we seem to be very prone to, I don't know if it's true or not, but there's a certain perception, and that everyone's taking supplements and, you know, minerals and vitamins and things like this. All those things that are being taken from the health food store and capsules, and people have lined them up. Is that having some good effect simply as a placebo, or are they really wasting their money?
I actually do quite a bit of work on supplements. Supplements are potent. They have very compelling mechanisms of action. And the key thing is, and I think it's rather disturbing, is we combine them based on what we read, the packaging, what our friends told us. You know, combining vitamin E, beta carotene, and vitamin C, you know, like I need a lot of antioxidants to kind of protect me, is not necessarily a good idea depending on your genotype. And we've shown that, you know, there's genes that modify the effects of these treatments such that you could benefit or you could increase your risk. And so I would say that supplements are they're definitely not placebos. And they have the potential to help you and they have the potential to harm you. And so I think we actually need to learn a lot more before we just kind of walk down the aisle, that aisle that we love, because you always feel like you're taking care of yourself and you're reading the thing like, you know, like, oh, I have cough, you know, let me find the thing, and, you know, I have migraine, or I have, you know, like pain. And I think we have to be really careful. And then there's some that don't work, and yes, you know, they're placebos and wonderful.
Yes, exactly. Obviously, we're here at the Science of Consciousness conference, so a lot of the conversation here is about consciousness.
Yeah.
And how, when we consider our conscious experience, it's a very sort of complex terrain to really examine. We're obviously, as humans, we're in the business of creating meaning constantly, understanding why we're sitting here. These are chairs, this is a room, and etc. We have what's going on now. So meaning creation is clearly a massively important part of cognition and what it means to be human. And when we bring placebo, which is essentially another sort of belief system, shall we say, what can we learn about consciousness by studying placebo? What's in there for us?
Yeah, very interesting question. And I approach it from multiple levels. So for instance, let's think about our collective consciousness around placebos, or the consciousness of medicine around placebos, and how we've literally, by avowing and disavowing placebos at the same time, by saying they're powerful, so let's control for them, and also saying they don't work, they're just, you know, it's just in your head. We have created this weird dissonance that somehow allows us to design drugs around them, and to really limit people's access to them by saying it's unethical to give people a placebo. So I think there's this consciousness that has been built up around placebos without us even knowing. And it's allowed us to do randomized clinical trials and see people have positive effects on the placebo arm of treatments, and to walk away from that because the drug didn't work. Which I think is what are we thinking? You know, like, why are we doing that, right? So I think there's an effect on our collective consciousness. And then I do think it tells us something about ourselves as human beings who are making meaning and using, whether we're aware of it or not, that meaning to have perceptions and experience our bodies. So, you know, medicine tells us a story, whether it's about our condition or the treatment of our condition, and we process that story sometimes to our benefit, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily help us. And so I do think medicine is a wonderful, and placebos are a wonderful example of how tuning and focusing our consciousness on our bodies can shift what we experience.
So the last question, I've been reading quite a little bit about shamanic practices, and obviously the sort of the mainstream view is that this is some rather primitive activity, and you know, it's almost as if, you know, some sort of, perhaps a shaman is some kind of psychotic dysfunctional figure that exists on the periphery of society, and people go to the shaman, and, you know, so that's sort of one. Another aspect is that the shaman actually has quite remarkable access to information, insights into the fine-scale workings of the mind and the body and what we are, and maybe what we are is not what we think we are. And this access really takes us into another realm which Western society can't even approach. Do you have any sort of opinion on that? Because I should think from a pharmacological point of view, it's quite interesting. You've got spirit medicine, as it's called, ayahuasca, something like that. It does seem to throw open into a whole other realm of sort of reality within our sort of psychic space. I wonder if there's anything you have on that?
Yeah, well, Ted Kaptchuk did a wonderful paper comparing the physician ritual of a physician encounter with a patient to a Navajo healing ritual. And so I think it's very easy to see the similarities in our processes in a clinical setting. And far be it from me to discredit thousands of years of practice, and to belittle it, because you can, it'd be one thing to say that they haven't done the trials, but they've done these, 1,000-year trials of these very potent drugs, and they understand how to administer them and all the kind of important words to use around the administration, and even, I think, evoking, for instance, I think is it ayahuasca where you vomit? I mean, that alone is sending a signal to the body that, something very powerful is going to happen, because I'm looking at this, like this very dramatic experience I'm having, throwing up for however long it takes to get to the point where you get to the next level. So I think they're amazing parallels, and I don't really think it benefits us to minimize them. I think it more benefits us to understand and to borrow anything that we can from these practices. I think the brain is, we're just learning. We're just starting to understand. There's so many things, as we saw with, these neural networks, and the incredible wiring of our I mean, we just don't know how these drugs play out, how these interactions play out. And I think being open to it and learning is really all we can do.
Yeah.
It doesn't benefit us to kind of dismiss it.
Right.
It more benefits us to be open.
KATHRYN, first, thank you so much for talking to me today. I hope we see you in Tucson. It's such a great subject and really fascinating.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your questions.
Yeah,
excellent
thank you so
questions.
much.
Yeah.
My name is Dr. Ashima. I'm from Dalberg Educational Institute. I'm a clinical psychologist working there as a postdoc in the Department of Psychology. So I'm working with depression patients and working with the effect of Rag Yaman. So I've done a sample study of 30 patients, 30 subjects I have taken for the study.
Could I just, sorry to interrupt, could I just ask you, what is this, Rag Yaman?
Rag Yaman describes it is a mood elevator rag without medication or psychotic medicines. You can elevate somebody's mind. So we are working in the area of music. It's one kind of a particular rag, which is when a person sings a rag or listen any music of Rag Yaman, he feels very, very good, and alpha waves are produced while his mood is elevated. He is able to think positive, and he is a better individual, and his psychological and subjective well-being will be better when he listens. So without medications, through counseling, through relaxation, through so many other psychosomatic therapies, I have given this treatment. So this is a biofeedback instrument. We have seen his temperature. When the person was in depression, his temperature was not normal, high, or sometimes low, or his BP and his EEG parameters or ECG parameters were not normal. So when we gave 20 minutes of intervention therapy daily to that patient, he becomes very active and mood elevated. Therapy has been given, and it has seen through these all instruments that when we check all these parameters, the patient becomes normal, because the norepinephrine and serotonin level goes down or sometimes very high when depression is high. So without medication, it's a remarkable study in India, and that without medication, through some music therapy, you are transforming his well-being.
Tell me your name, please.
Nancy Wolf.
Hello, Nancy. So we have spoken to you before in the past. Very nice to see you again, Nancy.
The name of my poster is God Absolutely Does Exist. And what I want to do is use my neuroscience background to prove that the belief in God is pre-wired into the way our brains are organized. In other words, we were born biologically to arrive at that belief or disbelief. And this includes atheists as well, because whether it's a strong belief in one's God, and that can take various forms, or it's a disbelief, a firm disbelief, the same parts of the brain light up with neural imaging. So we know this highest belief is very meaningful to people, because what it does is God is all loving, God is all knowing. Typically in many religious systems, whatever, it will decrease uncertainty. So if we're not sure what path to choose, we're not sure what behavior to exhibit, we can go back to our traditions, and usually there will be an answer there or something that will quiet us down. If we're feeling unloved, for example, God will love us. At least most of the traditions teach that. But what is it? Where does this highest principle get its magic, so to speak? Well, I'm going to go and rely on quantum entanglement, a theoretical premise, but nonetheless, just like we have the connectome, I'm hypothesizing here that we have a quantectome.
Okay, this is your word?
Yes,
excellent.
yes,
Okay,
I coined this word.
Good.
Okay, quantectome is the way that we could connect through quantum entanglement, and again, this is theoretical, hypothetical. We don't have experimental proof for this yet, but presuming that these different segments of dendrites that are built of bundles of microtubules, and that there are small-scale quantum entanglements between the tubule and dimers that nonetheless spread then through the protofilaments and through the microtubules and the bundles, when they are in parallel with other dendrite segments, and when there are electromagnetic field effects, it's conceivable and maybe even likely that these entanglements could spread throughout a patch of cerebral cortex. Now, they could also spread to areas that are connected by classical connections. But what makes this highest principle special is that I'm hypothesizing that, like according to Stuart Hameroff, that there are ripples in the fine scale structure of the universe, that what determines the way our brain biology builds this connectome is governed by these principles of the universe, and that it is within the bounds of each and every one of our brains and minds being connected to the universe through our highest principles. In other words, that those organizing laws dictate how the brain is wired, much the way Noam Chomsky suggested that our brains are pre-wired for language, and that accounts for the universality of language. I'm theorizing that the way our brains connect enables this quantum entanglement that enables us to feel consciousness, to share consciousness, and ultimately to connect with our consciousness to the fundamental organizing principles of the universe. And I hope to write a popular book on this topic.
Nancy, that is a huge undertaking. I got to congratulate you on pulling this one out of the hat. Let me just ask you this: how does Stuart feel about this? Have you discussed this with him?
No.
No. What do you think his reaction might be?
Skeptical.
Maybe. We'll see. But you know, of course, he does in his own presentations. He does talk about the this sort of fine scale structure, this being somehow, how should we say, equivalent to or synonymous with, Brahman, the Tao, the fundamental force, this sort of thing.
Yes, and I might also add, Stuart always likes to talk about Bing. Bing is the conscious moment when the collapse occurs. And I would like to say that the God concept is probably the big Bing.
The big Bing. Oh! I see what you did there. Nancy, thank you so much. Good luck with it. We'll wait for the book next year and we'll plug it for you. So I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central Eva Jablonka. Eva, welcome, and could you just tell us very briefly something about yourself, where you're from, and what is your field?
I'm a professor in the Conn Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science. I did my PhD in genetics. My main work is in theoretical biology and evolutionary biology, and I became interested in the question of the evolution of consciousness many years ago, like 15 years ago, and we have just produced, after 12 years of writing a book have come out about this subject. So this is my background is basically evolutionary biology, genetics, and philosophy.
In this situation, I think it would be because when at a conference like this, when we discuss consciousness, that word can sort of mean different things to different people. So when you say the evolution of consciousness, what kind of consciousness are you talking about?
I'm talking about minimal consciousness. So I'm not talking about what people call reflective consciousness, that is thinking about thinking or thinking about feeling or some things like that, but the actual feeling of being, of seeing red, of feeling fatigue, of pain, and all these things. So we're talking about phenomenal consciousness. And the question that we are asking, and when I'm saying we, I mean me and my colleague Simona Ginsburg, with whom I worked all these years and with whom I wrote the book. And so we ask the question how something like that, like this phenomenal consciousness came into being during evolution. Because if you take an evolutionary perspective and you think about it, it is the only creatures that we know are conscious are living creatures. And if it is a property of biological organisms, then it came into being during evolutionary history. So the question was, how can we approach this subject from an evolutionary perspective?
One of the tantalizing thoughts that goes along with thinking about evolution is the fact that it's never finished.
Yeah.
And we are, in a sense, in a snapshot of a moment in time, and one can project forward. I don't know how long we've got, but if we were to somehow survive through the crises we've created for ourselves, in terms of what happens to consciousness over time and human consciousness, do we have to just wait and see what happens, or is there some way we can predict the evolution of consciousness into the future?
When you're thinking about the evolution of consciousness from minimal consciousness and going on, consciousness, obviously, once you had minimal consciousness, if you evolved better sense organs, if the freedom of your action, you could coordinate your movements better, of course this affected the range of things that you experienced. So in terms of, and of course, if we will enhance our capacities for memory, our capacities for storing information, our sensory capacities, humans will have a much greater and richer consciousness that they have at the moment. But I cannot tell you about the next jump in consciousness. I don't have the imagination to understand another mode of being, because what has happened with consciousness was that a new mode of being came into the world. I mean, from living creatures to sentient creatures. This is something that only a posteriori can you analyze it. I cannot tell you if there will be a qualitative new mode of being of something that we will not call human anymore, because it will be a completely different creature in every sense. But I can imagine human beings that have a much, much, much broader much broader sensory, perceptual, memory ability. And maybe in some way it will make a huge change to the way they perceive very basic things. But I can't really imagine it.
Yes, it's difficult because we, in a sense, it would be an adaptive thing, one assumes. And so what are we adapting to now in our
I'm not sure
way?
Some things will be adaptive for sure. As I said, I don't think it's a good idea to think about consciousness in terms of what is its function, what is it adaptive for. I think it is better to think about consciousness as a system that has as a goal-directed and goal-directing system. And this is not the same as thinking about functions. In the same way that you will not ask what is the function of life, but you will ask about all kinds of processes that make it possible to live in different environments. They have functions, but life itself, does it have function? No. The same is true for consciousness, and I think the same is true for every time a new mode of being comes into being. Then you can ask about the functions of all the different things that generate and constitute this new mode of being, and you can ask, well, how do they contribute to this mode of being? Yes, then you can ask that, and this is a very, very relevant and important question. But I don't even know how to, but because I don't really imagine this new mode of being that goes beyond the symbolic cultural system of human beings who are also sentient and who are also alive, I can't even imagine it. I can't even imagine very well what robots will be like. Not when I really try to give, I can imagine it at the very, I read science fiction. And in the science fiction, I sort of already give them a lot of, endow these robots with a lot of my own presuppositions about consciousness, which come from me as a human being. But when I really try to think about somebody who builds a robot from scratch and what this entity will be, what with this entity which has completely different bodily constitution will be like, I don't, and also the fact and also the kind of mentality that it will have, I don't really know what, I don't feel I understand it at all. Not when I actually try to divorce it from myself and from my own intuitions about what it's like to be a human being.
Yes. So the future is a mystery, yet to be written.
I think that the future is not entirely a mystery because there's no doubt that we shall enrich our modes of our consciousness. I have no doubt about that. We shall do that unless, of course, we destroy ourselves, which is also very valid, very possible. But if we won't, it will happen. But beyond that, if you ask me about a new mode of being, I cannot tell you. This, for me, it is a mystery.
Okay, well, that's a wonderful place to leave it for now. I always like dwelling in the mystery, shall we say? Yeah. Eva, thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon. That was really very interesting and enjoyable.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully we'll see you another time at TSC.
I hope so.
And now I'm with Scott Olson. Scott, can you tell me something about your poster, please?
Yes, well, what I'm really emphasizing is that throughout nature you have ratios, particularly the golden ratio, but also square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 5, but they're actually derivative. It's interesting. What we've discovered is that once you have the golden ratio, which is really more of a principle, and you have Plato called it the indefinite dyad, the greater and the lesser, and that was always the big question. Everybody knew there was the one. What the heck is the greater and the lesser? Well, it turns out that the greater is what we call big 5, 1.6180339, and the lesser is its reciprocal, 0.6180339. And so those, along with unity, are what are behind everything in the universe, and top to bottom, scale independent. So Plato did it when he said, take a line, cut it unevenly. Why a line? Because with a line, you can get the golden cut. You can't do it with numbers because they're irrational. And he said, cut it unevenly. Well, if you cut it evenly, you'll get a ratio of 2 is to 1 and 1 is to 1 in the parts, and those aren't equal. What you want is something, a single cut that immediately gives you proportion. And you get that with the golden cut. Ancient Egyptians called it the primordial scission. They built it into the Great Pyramid. That's why the Great Pyramid is so special. But it's also in the aesthetics of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, the Erechtheum, the Caryatids, all over the place. But then what I found, and I'll show you my discovery, had an epiphany when I was in London working with Keith Critchlow and John Michel at Buckfast Abbey. I had a waking dream where I realized if you have a right-angled triangle that has the greater and the lesser as the legs, you necessarily get exactly square root of 3. I also found that if you take your compass here, arc down, and take that length there, flip it up, this becomes the square root of the golden ratio. And so I developed this golden chalice of Orion because it has a shape similar to Orion. You then take that diagonal, or this one here, that's exactly root 2. So what's happening is, out of these principles, the others derive, and of course how this ties up with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff is the microtubules. And there you have with the microtubules, you have Fibonacci numbers over here, 13 filaments, 8 spiraling one way, 5 the other. Anytime you have adjacent Fibonacci numbers, you have a golden ratio approximation. At the tips of the microtubules are clathrons. Clathrons are buckyballs. They're truncated icosahedra. So when you cut the corners off the icosahedron, these rectangles, this is one, that's exactly 3 golden ratios. So what's happening in nature is everything is resonating to these frequencies, and the microtubules, these quantum computers that are not only in the neurons, they're in the cells, and they're in the cells of mammals and of plants. And the other thing is that we should really get in here very quickly is the phyllotaxis. The majority of plants do spiral phyllotaxis, where there's a genetic angle, a divergence angle of 137.5 degrees. That's where the next leaf or bud tends to come up, and that's at the golden cut. So, and you find the same thing with the solar system. So if you take and look at Venus from the Earth over an 8-year period and connect the dots, you get a pentagram. But that's 13 years on Venus. 13 is to 8, is 8 is to 5, just like the microtubules. So it's scale independent. Even the universe, they're suggesting that it may be dodecahedral, much like Plato had said. So the key is resonance and going into resonance. So Siddhartha Gautama sits under the bo tree and he goes into a quantum coherent state. It's like superconductivity and superfluidity. And he goes into coherence, ultimately into samadhi with the universe itself. That's the real goal. So consciousness, everything is aware, everything's sentient, but we should have the brains enough to be smart enough to use it to go into cosmic consciousness.
I'm Pedro. I'm from Pedro Rezende from Lisbon. My postdoc started in pure mathematics, in operator algebras, but it's motivated by quantum theory all along. And here I'm making explicit an observation, which is there is a kind of structure coming out of describing quantum systems via Caesar algebras, which I can reproduce by just talking abstractly about qualia, which are the basic bits of consciousness, and enumerating some basic principles that they could satisfy. So the point is, I'm not describing qualia per se, but describing what their collection looks like. It's a mathematical space with certain properties, and in the end, I come up with a space which looks like the space I obtained from the Caesar algebras, which is like an abstract space of measurements on a system. So what one abstracts from this is that coming from 2 different directions, you get the same structure. In one case, the structure describes measurements, like Stern-Gerlach, spin measurements or something, and from the other direction, it describes qualia. And it looks like it's saying that a measurement could be thought of as a physical process, provided that there's some qualia associated with it. So it sort of goes back to some ideas in the Copenhagen school, where measurement and consciousness seem to be intertwined, but coming from a very different direction. I'm not talking about collapse of the wave function or anything. It's just that this algebra seems to be 2 different things at the same time. If you have 2 qualia, like I see red and I see blue, there's also another qualia, which is I can have the experience of, hey, there were 2 of them. That's qualia. And so there's a multiplication on this set. That's the first bit of structure that I have there, provided I have some minimal cognitive ability, like a bit of memory. So maybe worms can realize there's a multiplication. Maybe trees, I'm not sure. I mean, they seem to be sentient as well. A rock probably doesn't. So maybe this is not universal, but it can be quite general. But it produces a theory of observation in some sense, which then depends on some very basic, very general, but still some assumptions about the observers. So at least this ability to detect repetition should be there.
I'm here with Thomas Koenig. Thomas, hi. And you're from?
From Bern. Yes.
From Bern, so you're from Switzerland.
Yes.
You're our first Swiss poster representative here.
I'm a person who investigates EEG. And in EEG, when we look at it in this topographic way, we see brief periods where this scalp field configuration remains really stable. And if we think of that in terms of activation patterns of brain regions, we must conclude that we have predominantly oscillations that are either in phase or out of phase. And Pascal Fries, he presented a model here where he proposed that these in and out of phase oscillations are a very efficient mechanism to gate the flow of information between brain regions. Okay, so that model here is very compatible with the global observation that we have here. And if we, in addition, assume that for a conscious experience, information needs to be integrated, and that this integration also has to be flexible, we can see the same thing, but we can have different mental states. Such a mechanism would allow that. It would allow a flexible switching of the integration patterns here that we have between brain regions, and that could then eventually produce different mental states for the same input. That's the main idea here of this microstate.
Okay, excellent. So now these are what we're looking at here. Mm-hmm. This is communication through coherence.
Yes,
you're saying,
right. Yes.
And the word coherence in this context, mm-hmm. we're talking about the wavelengths of electrical signals. Yes.
Yes. Basically, rather slow oscillations of cortical excitability. And just by switching the phase of these oscillations, one can imagine that the brain is very flexible in gating or blocking communication. If you switch the phase of one of these regions here, which is something that, for example, the thalamus could easily do, we could switch on a global scale the entire pattern of communication between regions, and that would allow the brain to adaptively change the way information is being integrated.
And in this next segment, I sit down with Dr. Manny Bhaumik, scientist, philanthropist, entrepreneur, and founder of the Manny Bhaumik Institute for Theoretical Physics at UCLA. Dr. Bhaumik is a great supporter of this conference and indeed this program, and it's a great honor to have him as a guest. We join the interview as he discusses his cosmology, his idea for the deeper nature of things, the merging of the experiential and the physical.
Reigning advanced theory of physics that is really has been pretty much tied down is quantum field theory of standard model, where all the particles that we observe can be fit nicely into like a periodic table type table, which we call table of standard models of particle physics. And that's, in that sense, it's pretty well established. But at the same time, it is not the last word, because it doesn't have gravity, it doesn't have dark matter, dark energy, or supersymmetry, and some of these things. So it probably would be expanded, but would not be invalidated. Just like Newton's law has not been invalidated, we still use it for designing cars, rockets, and all these. But when you go to higher speed or higher, stronger gravity, then of course you have to use Einstein's general relativity. But that doesn't mean Newton's law has gone away. And people have gotten Nobel Prizes usually they happen to take back one Nobel Prize in physics yet. So even though it's expanded, so in that sense, in its energy range of 1 tera electron volt that LHC produces, in that energy range, which is all we really deal with in our daily lives. Standard model does it very extremely well, and there's not too many people who would disagree the standard model is here to stay. That's why it's called effective quantum field theory, because we don't know whether it's at still higher energies. It'll be superseding, or you need some extension. But if you accept that premise, that standard model is here to stay, as Newton's law is here to stay in spite of Einstein's relativities, its basic idea there is that this whole unimaginably vast universe is filled with these fields. There's no place where it is not. Ordinary classical field like gravity, for example, that we feel is Earth's gravity, which is pinning you down. We go about our business without thinking about it, without even, without even really have it in our mind at all. And yet it's there, and you can touch, you cannot see, but you just try to lift yourself up from chair, then you know that it's there. But this classical gravity has a source, which is Earth's, with Earth, and so. But if you go to Moon, weight would be 6 times less, because the Moon's gravity is 6 times less. If you go to space, you're floating, there is no gravity. So these are, we're talking about classical field, but the quantum fields is intertwined with space itself. You can separate it, so it's everywhere, even there is no manifest or classical manifestation of the field. And so it is a entity, all these, every particle, every force particle or matter particle, they have a corresponding field from which it's a quanta of the field. And so in that sense, the same, you're made of particles, I'm made of particles, so is he, but they all have a common source. Not only just us, everything that we see. So that really paves the way of unifying, and because they all come from the same source. It's just that our software has been built from our experience in a different way that makes you different than me. But basically, at the fundamental level, it's all coming from quantum fields. Now, one of the characteristics of the quantum field is, and it is beyond doubt in terms of mathematical proof, is that it is always full of infinite dynamism, infinite activity. Quantum field cannot be addressed. It has to always have some action. It's always alive with activity. And that has some very special property. Number one is that any particular event is totally spontaneous and completely unpredictable as to exactly when that event is going to take place. And this is only a slow motion description of what's going on. What's really going on is that these things are happening very fast. Some slower, but some are very fast. And in general, it's much faster than if the evolution would have made us feel prepared to feel it, we'll go dizzy. It is so fast. But every space-time element locally, these things are spontaneously coming and going with infinite number. Because in mathematical terms, we say that every space-time element of a quantum field has the infinite degrees of freedom of creation and destruction. So even without self-energy, creating self-energy for a while, and if there is energy, of course, it will become a particle. But if there's no energy, it will still, Feynman used to say, creating and destroying, what a waste of time. But that's how quantum fields are. It has this defining characteristic that it's totally spontaneous and always active. Always active, totally spontaneous and unpredictable, and yet, in spite of this infinite activity at each space-time element, the fundamental layer of existence that we have been able to find so far, ultimate layer of reality, which is not last, of course, again, at least what we have been able to find is that these things are happening locally in each space-time element. Now, what do we have here in common with consciousness? Consciousness is always active, spontaneous. It has unpredictability, and it has intuition, which you cannot have any other. Intuition is something we cannot explain how it comes, but only conscious being can have intuition, and that drives all science and everything. Of course, that quantum fields, whether it has intuition or not, we do not know. But what we know for sure is that in spite of this incredibly fast, infinite dynamism at each point, the average value of the quantum field has remained exactly the same, immutable since the beginning of time. That needs some self-referral. There is a source built in, which is so eerily similar to consciousness that eventually this thing is built in. You cannot take it out from it, even if you cannot stop it. It's just going to go on and on. And my gut feeling is that that's where we'll get the ontology of consciousness, because it's built in the space-time itself. And in fact, we know that this activity is carried over to quantum domain of particles, because all particles have this uncertainty, so that it become a wave packet. And but when it's created, it is not a wave packet; it's a sinusoidal wave. But pretty soon becomes a wave packet because of the interaction with other fields. All the quantum fields interacts. At least in our manifest world, they're all separate. But they're if you extrapolate the strength of all of these various fields, they all emerge to one value towards the Planck's constant. As you go to Planck's length, as you go towards Planck's length, they start to extrapolate, they start to emerge. But that is what supersymmetry, is required. But our daily world is a broken symmetry. All symmetry is broken. Everything has a separate existence, but they all interact, and that's why the inherently indeterministic nature of quantum physics comes in. So, where Einstein went wrong, he thought that he will make a run around with this uncertainty and explain everything with our daily classical macroscopic physical reality. That happens to be, from Bell's experiment now, it happens to be that quantum world has its own reality, which is, as I mentioned, spontaneous, unpredictable, and always active, because we know that all of these possibilities actually are happening. We can measure that from various experiments, and yet it has a self-referral. It knows what its value has to be, unchanging over eons since the beginning of time. And so how it's so close to that 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 it has to have, some awareness. Proto-consciousness, I think, is coming from there.
I just want to thank you very much for sharing all your thoughts this afternoon.
Thank you for.
That's a great place to finish. It is without limit. We hope, we believe,
yes,
and we'll see.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, madam.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
And that's it for this second programme in our three-part series of Consciousness Central 2019. I hope you've enjoyed it. Be sure to join me for the final programme. Until then, bye for now.